One of the most influential scholars in Puerto Rico is Francis Negrón-Muntaner, Colonialism, Nationalism, and the State of Latinos in U.S. Media, this week on The Feminist Perspective.
The Feminist Perspective with Dr. Sophia Johnson is made possible by Hollingsworth Real Estate Group. Ask Hollingsworth about real estate. And by Allstate. You're in good hands.
Until 1994, she was best known as a controversial artist, political activist, and filmmaker. Then, Francis Negrón-Muntaner published Boricua Pop, Puerto Ricans and the Latinization of American Culture, a collection of essays that helped us understand the media's representation of pop icons like Jennifer Lopez, who has reluctantly established herself as an often provocative sex symbol. Now, Francis Negrón-Muntaner is best known as a cultural critic, and Hispanic Business calls her one of the nation's 100 most influential Latinos. She fights for the rights of women and people of color in film, politics, and culture.
When you think about Latino politics in the United States, it's almost every 4 years people come out, pundits, experts, politicians, journalists, to talk about when is the sleeping giant going to awaken. And basically what they mean is, when are Latinos finally going to vote in the numbers that they exist in the electorate? But I like to think that voting is important, but that perhaps Latinos' biggest contributions to American politics are in the imagination. And I emphasize the imagination because when discrimination and injustice are the norm, and even the law, you need creativity and imagination to think about how things can be otherwise.
Sure. Francis Negrón-Muntaner, welcome to The Feminist Perspective.
Really glad to be here.
Great. Now, I know you're a role model to so many people, including myself, a visionary and really a daring cultural critic, and of course an advocate for taking action in a way that might not be comfortable and even controversial. And I think thinking about the work that you're doing, we often forget about where we were 100 years ago. Can you talk to us a little bit about the legacy of colonialism on our culture?
Well, U.S. culture is still colonial in some ways. The first way is that the United States holds colonies in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. Most Americans are not aware of this because this is not taught in schools and not very well treated by the media. Mm-hmm. But for instance, where I'm from and where I write a lot about, Puerto Rico is a so-called U.S. unincorporated territory, which basically means that it belongs to, but it's not part of the United States. And it also means that Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, but they don't have a right to vote for president or have a proportional delegation in Congress. Mm-hmm. So one way that colonialism is still with us is just the bare fact that the U.S. holds colonies.
Right.
The second way is that you could argue that even though the United States as a nation state became independent from Britain, and therefore achieve formal independence,
right,
the hierarchies that conform the colonial world are still with us. And those hierarchies are of gender, of race, of sexuality. So for instance, if you think about the very category of race that people find so important to identify themselves and are identified as,
right,
this is not a universal category.
Yeah.
This has not been a category that has been available for people to identify as
right,
for all of humanity's history. It came about and consolidated during the process of colonization of the Americas and the genocide of Native people and enslavement of Africans.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know when we were talking a couple of weeks ago, you talked a little bit about drawing a distinction. It was really important to you to draw a distinction between colonialism and coloniality. Can you help the viewers understand?
Sure. So colonialism generally means that there is one state or empire that holds another territory and extracts from that territory. Sometimes people from the nation state, the empire, settle in that territory, and sometimes they don't.
Right.
So for instance, in the case of Puerto Rico and other unincorporated territories of the U.S., none of them have a majority of, let's say, U.S. population settling there. So it's not that type of colonialism. But in general, it means that one state holds control over another country. Mm-hmm. Coloniality describes how even after formal colonialism is over, because there's the states become independent or colonial territories become independent, hierarchies continue, the same hierarchy. So if you ask yourself, why are countries in the Caribbean like Haiti or Jamaica or the Dominican Republic,
Yeah.
Still relatively impoverished after decades or hundreds of years of being independent.
Sure.
Coloniality has something to do with that, in the sense that although they became formally independent, their insertion into global economy and their relationship with their former colonial masters might not have shifted that much,
Right.
or another entity like the United States might have filled the void of the colonial master in dominating aspects of the economy and politics.
Right, sure, and probably with loans and different types of foreign aid.
Absolutely. Right now I study debt.
Yeah.
Because as many people might know, Puerto Rico has a major debt crisis.
Sure.
But when I started studying debt in the Caribbean, you realize that debt has been a form of imperial governance in the Caribbean. And the first very obvious case was Haiti, where enslaved people rose up against colonialism
Right.
and against enslavement, became the first black republic in the world. And then was punished for that,
In essence.
by the French imposing that they pay back the slave owners.
Yeah.
And they actually didn't stop paying those debts until the 1940s.
I didn't even know that.
So when people ask, is Haiti poor? That's really the wrong question. The question is, how has colonialism and coloniality
Sure.
impoverished Haiti for the critical action of enslaved people rising against slavery and colonialism?
Right. Now, how is this extended into the continental U.S.?
Well, the United States also had enslavement. The descendants of slaves are still discriminated against, brutalized by police, face discrimination in the courts, in education. So that is coloniality. Populations like, for instance, Mexican Americans in the United States are also a population that became part of the United States because of colonialism,
Sure.
a war with Mexico that then transferred, virtually the whole southwest of the United States, which was part of Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And the Mexicans that the border moved on them, like they like to say, now became Americans or U.S. citizens, also face systemic discrimination in every aspect of life. There was a case in California called Mendez versus Westminster, in which a group of Mexican parents came together to demand that their children not be segregated because of their Mexican identity. And the school district even tried to get some of these parents to say, okay, we'll admit your children and you can drop the lawsuit. The Latino parents said, no, we're not going to do that, because what's at stake here is not only our children, what's at stake are thousands of children in California and elsewhere. They imagined a world where not only their children could go to school in desegregated facilities, but 5,000 Mexican children could also do so in the area.
In Boricua Pop, Puerto Ricans and the Latinization of American culture, you explored the social construction of shame. And I just wanted to shift gear a little bit to talk a little bit about the key findings in this publication. And relevant here is the fact that another legacy of colonialism remains the sites of shameful identification in our culture. From concepts of beauty to criminality and victimhood, I think we're trying to recover from the constituted effects of colonialism on the nation state and really wrestling, as you touched on, with gender and other social orders. Can you talk a little bit about some of the key findings, the key takeaways from your research in that project? Well,
part of the process of colonialism is stigmatizing the identities of the subject people. So let's say if you're Puerto Rican or any member of the Black diaspora in the Americas or indigenous, your identity is being stigmatized as inferior and put in a hierarchy, right? So one of the things that I was interested in is what happens when Puerto Ricans whose Puerto Rican identity is often denigrated by U.S. media and U.S. legal discourse. The mere fact that you are citizens that don't have full rights. What happens when those people take on center stage in popular culture? Because if you're made to feel ashamed of who you are, the affect of shame makes you not want to be seen.
Sure.
Whereas when you're a pop star, the whole world is looking at you.
Right.
So what I was interested in seeing, what happens when Puerto Ricans take that center stage, the whole world is looking at them.
Yeah.
How do they negotiate this shame? How do they, or in some cases, successfully transfer the shame from themselves to these structures of power?
Are there any entertainers you have in mind? I mean, you touched on a few of them in the book.
Well, for instance, on my chapter on Jennifer Lopez, which was the first full-time, full treatment on her that an academic ever wrote, I was interested in the discourse on her body. Because actually a lot has changed since then.
Sure.
At that time, she came on stage and the shaming discourse was that she was overweight, that her body shape didn't conform to U.S. standards of beauty.
Right.
And how did she negotiate that? Well, basically, she affirmed her beauty and insisted that someone with her body proportions and her body type could be beautiful.
Right.
And of course, that process succeeded in large part because of demographic changes in the United States.
Sure.
So, for instance, the media looks to the younger demographics, 18 to 25, as their main consumers of media.
Right.
So it happens that in the last few decades, that sector of the population has become more of color.
Right.
African American, Latino, Asian, so forth. So, so in part, she won that fight because the demographics support her own views of who is beautiful
And what is beauty?
and what is beauty.
Well, and that in that particular instance, you're absolutely right. She won that fight. But I think about areas where this idea of sort of turning it around has not quite worked out, and that's, for example, in the African American community and using the N-word, for example, as a way to sort of reduce its impact. What are your thoughts on the?
Before going, I would say that we have to qualify that Jennifer Lopez won the macro fight, let's say. So she has a career, and she's been on top of her game for over 2 decades, and no Latina actress before her had achieved that.
Yeah.
At the same time, if you look at her career over time, you'll see that she made changes to her star persona. That she did lose some weight, that she did get presented as more acceptable, let's say, to certain audiences over others over time as she became more well-known.
Sure.
So that's where you can see a little bit of the pressure
Yeah.
of coloniality, you know, on
yeah.
what's acceptable or not. And you can also see it on pop stars like Shakira. You know, the minute that you cross over, you become blonde, for instance.
For instance.
So in that regard, these victories can also be said to be relative. So I think she did help shift the conversation and to make it more acceptable, or contributed to make it more acceptable for other types of beauty to be recognized.
Right.
But that victory is never total, and it carries a price for performers that also have to give up some things and adapt and accept
Right.
to be presented in certain ways.
In today's expansive and powerful media, the extremely limited array of images representing Black and Latino people often perpetuates stereotypes that lead to racism and discrimination throughout society. In this context, can you help us understand Ed Morales' Latinx debate and why identity matters in this call to action?
Well, every generation likes to define itself, and that's not a mere exercise. It's because every cohort has different experiences.
Sure.
And are coming up in a different context. So I actually remember when a group of students at Columbia came to me asking me, what do you think about Latinx? And it wasn't as accepted as it is right now.
Right.
So it's been a process.
Right. And how long ago was that?
It was like 7 years ago.
Okay.
So in that regard, I think I view the adoption or the emergence of Latinx as a way to self-identify,
Right.
As a way to give voice to the particular experiences of a new generation of Latinos.
Sure.
In that regard, some of the criticisms are pretty beside the point. Like some people say, well, that's not proper Spanish.
Yeah.
or proper English,
Yeah.
or it's hard to pronounce, or it's hard to write,
Right.
or that kind of argument. I don't think it just doesn't seem to pretty much understand the process. If you, for instance, if you look at other ways that other communities have identified over time and how it shifted,
Right.
Negro is not the same as Black, and Black's not the same as African American.
Or colors, yeah.
Or colored. I mean, all these categories emerge in particular moments and become widespread and adopted because they speak better to a certain juncture.
But I still want to know, what do they mean? What is Latinx? What does that mean?
Well, Latinx.
And how did that emerge in the discourse?
I mean, Latin America, it emerges in part as a long struggle, or it settles a struggle over gender and sexuality in the term Latino. So there's a critique that Latino homogenizes the community by adopting a masculine category of identity. In Spanish, unlike English, moreover in Spanish, everything is gendered.
Yeah.
So part of it is a response to that, and part of it is that even in English, where there's less gendering, still Latino is a masculine generalization for the whole group. So this new generation wants to signal in the way they call themselves that they're inclusive of everybody, regardless of gender or sexual identification. So in that regard, you can see the X as a space for diversity and difference that doesn't need to be homogenized or clamped down by more dominant conceptions of identity.
Yeah. I recognize the need to self-identify and to embrace something that becomes more meaningful for the times that you're living in. But wonder, what this would mean and what signals it's sending perhaps to other communities that are grappling with these social orders, right? So, how might this impact the Asian community, for example, or other communities that are struggling to figure out how do we fit into this space?
Well, I think when every community self-identifies differently, or there's a shift, there's a before and after, I think it communicates to other people that this is the way they want to be seen and perceived. And I guess I might be in this debate. I have my own position that maybe not everybody's fighting about it. I'm not fighting about this or that invested in this debate.
Right.
Because I feel that we are living in a historical moment where people have settled that they have a right to identify themselves.
Right.
So even those people that call themselves Latinx, that doesn't mean that if you prefer to be called Latino or Latinao or Hispanic, or you prefer to be identified with your country of origin, or by racial identification, that there's no room for that. I feel that people should identify as they feel. And that other people should respect that.
Yeah, of course. Let's talk a little bit about the Latino media gap. You published a recent report. Talk to us a little bit about the findings in that report.
Well, the Latino media gap emerged from my advocacy as on media. I co-founded an organization called NALIP, the National Association of Latino Independent Producers, in the late 90s. And that organization really emerged in order to address issues of exclusion or marginalization of Latinos in the mainstream media industry. And after serving on the board, being chair of the board, organizing some of the conferences, I felt that after 10 years we have done so much, but at the same time it felt the needle was just not moving. So I felt like we had made such a difference to so many people's careers, like we provided opportunities for people to grow, to meet each other, but at the same time the mainstream indicators of inclusion and diversity were pretty much the same. So I stepped back and I said, let's look at this. Why is this happening? So what we did was like at the first quantitative study that was historical, that looked pretty far back. Because something that happens is that every year or every time that studios or networks are pressured, they come out with statistics that seem or suggest that there is improvement. But I wasn't so sure about that. So we took a long view. We looked back all the way to the 40s, and we discovered some stunning things. One of them was that Latino participation in U.S. media was higher in the 40s in movies and in the 70s in television than it is now.
It was actually higher.
Per capita. If you look at how many Latinos were in the United States and you looked at the representation in media, there was more representation per capita than today. And they said, why would that be? Well, actually, it was interesting because in the 40s, it had to do with pressures from above.
Yeah.
The good neighbor policy, the U.S. government instructed the media industry to produce films that had more positive representations of Latinos and Latin Americans. So the markets for American films in Latin America would not close down during the war. Because there have been a lot of protests by Mexico, for instance, for their portrayal of Mexicans in Hollywood movies.
Sure.
And in the 70s, it was actually pressure from below. The civil rights movements of Latinos, African Americans, identified media as one of those sources of coloniality, one of those sources that were perpetuating ideas about their groups that that they wanted to challenge.
Yeah.
So the pressure of the civil rights movement made television make some modifications. So it started casting more people of color and trying to offset a little bit the stereotypes and the like.
Right.
But when those movements started changing, there was a big political backlash in the United States in the 1980s. Things kind of went back to normal before the civil rights period, right?
Yeah.
So now what you have is major demographic growth and change that's pressuring the media to change. But you see that there's very different ways that television and film change.
Yeah.
So in film, you have nationals from Latin American countries, mostly Mexico, doing quite well, not doing Latino theme work though.
Yeah.
Whereas on television, you see a bit more change because television is much more subject to pressure from consumers than movies because movies make most of their earnings abroad.
Right.
Whereas television is subject to pressure because it's financed by advertising, and the advertising dollars come from the domestic consumer market.
Oh, I see. Wow, it's incredible. I mean, have you been paying attention to the recent Oscar issue? What's the story here?
Well, actually, I'm working on a report.
Okay.
That's going to be released soon. About the representation of women and people of color in award shows.
Okay.
Some of these graphs are heartbreaking.
Yeah. What are you finding?
Well, I can tell you everything I'm finding, but I can tell you that some groups are near zero for decades.
Yeah.
Two groups have this zigzag kind of pattern, so they don't really become incorporated. It's just kind of flukes. And there's one group that, relatively speaking, in some categories, does show an up trend. But overall, it's another instance of how decades of organizing and pressure is still not paying off.
I'm getting the signal that I'm running out of a little bit of time, so I'm just going to circle back to the postscript of this book. I really like this book. I know it was published a long time ago, but it pulled me into your early work, and I found that it still has a lot of, it resonates, and I think that if someone's out there looking for a deconstructed analysis, I think it would be insightful. In the postscript of the book, anyway, I read what can only be described as a call to action. You write, and pardon my Spanish, despierta boricua, which is wake up. Let's talk a little bit about the future of Latinos in the United States. What are the challenges and where are the opportunities for mobility and engagement? Is it just the media, as is echoed in what we've been talking about? Are there other spaces that we need to think about and explore?
Well, I think Latino life in the U.S. is becoming increasingly diverse. Because not only do you have multiple groups, origins, and that has also grown. In the U.S., mostly you had three groups, Cubans in Florida, Puerto Ricans in the Northeast, and Mexican Americans in the Southwest.
Right.
But actually, some of the fastest growing groups, Latino groups in the U.S. are from countries like Ecuador, from Central America, and also people have moved. So Puerto Ricans are moving south and to Florida, and sometimes also to Texas and California. Mexicans are moving to New York. So for instance, in 20-some years, Mexicans might be the largest Latino group in New York.
Wow.
So these shifts have created a very different Latino community. So before, people were kind of in their ethnic national enclaves, but now they're everywhere. For instance, the movement of Latinos to the south is new. Particularly to
the Carolinas,
above Florida, right? So this is creating a very diverse Latino community with very different experiences. But I think the politics of this, apart from media, there's still very little Latino representation in national government. And when some of Latinos make it there and are expressing the views of some Latinos, they get a lot of backlash, like we have right now with Alexandria Ocasio. So I think the challenges are that still Latinos are seen as foreigners. They're seen as recent immigrants, although some Latinos have been in this country even before the United States was the United States. And in terms of just like everyday issues, I think Latinos are as concerned as most people about the quality or lack thereof of education for their children.
Right. Very good. So we hear education, we hear politics. On the subject of politics, there is Beto. Any quick predictions in 30 seconds before we wrap up this show in terms of what he can do in terms of changing the way we think about Latino engagement, the Hispanic engagement in
Well, he's
national
not
politics.
Latino, so I'm not sure. I mean, he's from Texas, and he does have some identification with Latino communities, but I don't think Latinos see him as
one of their own.
Or expect him to shift things for Latinos. I mean, there is a Latino candidate, Julian Castro, in the primaries. But Latinos behave politically in a very complex way.
Sure.
Unlike other groups that tend to vote more in bloc, Latino political or voting behavior is very complex. So it will really depend on who the candidate is, and if that candidate is people perceive that candidate to be truly understanding of what people consider are Latino issues for that election.
Very nice. Well, Frances Negrón-Muntaner, thank you so much for coming to The Feminist Perspective.
Thank you for having me.
The Feminist Perspective with Dr. Sophia Johnson is made possible by Hollingsworth Real Estate Group. Ask Hollingsworth about real estate. And by Allstate. You're in good hands.